So a lot of us want to learn about new topics, whether it's neuroscience, physics, or mathematics. However, after the initial source of inspiration, we often get distracted and don't really know where to begin. We feel overwhelmed by the amount of information, or in general, we don't really know how to make any meaningful progress. So have you ever felt really overwhelmed by all the information that you wanted to learn, or by all the topics that you find engaging? I think in the current day and age, being able to learn a skill fast and effectively is one of the highest currencies we have. And I definitely think that as PhDs and scientists, we are trained in acquiring skills that are difficult to acquire, and also have gotten the ability to kind of structure our own learning processes when no information about certain topics is present yet. So currently for a postdoc project, I'm in the progress of learning about cognition and psychosis, which are both topics that I know something about, but I'm definitely not an expert on. And I kind of wanted to take you along as to how I structure my learning process and how I kind of engage with these topics, to show you almost this ability of structuring your own learning process and creating your own learning path. So during my PhD, one of the things that I noticed that was most difficult was to create your own learning process and knowing how to structure one's learning, and also knowing how to tackle a new topic that you are interested in. So for example, how to find resources, how to structure the entire self-learning process, etc. So in this video, I kind of want to show you how I do this and take you along in every step. So we're really gonna deep dive in how to create your own self-learning path and how to structure this learning. So it's gonna be a little bit of a long video, but I think it will definitely be really interesting if you are currently a bachelor student, a master student, a PhD student, or just someone that wants to learn more about a topic in a deep and meaningful way, and not really in a shallow way that's sometimes promoted by the internet. So let's dive straight into it. So the first topic that I want to talk about is how to structure your learning. And I kind of divided it into 3 phases. So the first step I would say for structuring your learning is to be really clear about the goal you have. So what do you want to be able to do at the end of your learning process? So do you want to write an essay, hold a discussion, or build a specific tool, for example? So personally, I find this one of the most important steps. And the reason for that is, I think if you embark on a learning journey without a clear goal, you can kind of meander through the information without really retaining any of it. So I've talked about this before, but I think the application of knowledge is almost one of the most fundamental steps for solidifying knowledge and really deeply engaging with a topic. So unless I personally apply some knowledge that I've learned in one of the projects that I'm working on, I'm very likely to forget it, even though some of the topics or some of the knowledge that I learned can be relatively easy. If I don't engage in it in a meaningful way, it's just gone very easily. So I do have to say, these goals don't have to be big goals like winning the Nobel Prize, but they can be really small. So for example, you can think of something as writing a short blog post on a topic, being able to solve a specific equation for mathematics, or implementing a machine learning tool if you're learning about AI. So for me personally, my current goal is to learn about, or to create, a normative modeling tool for cognition and its role in predicting individualized signals for people with psychosis. And the final thing that I want to do with this is to write a paper about this topic. And this is in general a really big goal, so this will probably take about a year. So I also have to say that your goals don't have to be short term, they can be a little bit long term, but also have little intermediate goals, like maybe writing 500 words or creating 1 figure a day, such that you can kind of keep motivated. So that kind of brings me on the second topic of goal setting, and that is also, I find it really good, or personally really helpful, to write down the motivation as to why you want to learn something. So personally, I feel that motivation definitely weakens over time. And even though you might be super motivated right now, in 6 months, if you only got negative results, you may have lost some of this motivation. So I personally write down my motivation somewhere on like a post-it note or in a little bullet journal like the one I have here. And the reason I write it down is to look at it's sometimes when I forget as to why I even embarked on some specific learning journey. So for me personally, the motivation as to why I want to write this paper is that for my career, it will be really good as a researcher. But also in general, I want to keep on working on this topic. I find it a really important topic, and I also have some personal reasons that connect me to this topic. So I want to help individuals that are struggling with this, and I think I'm personally really intrinsically really motivated. But in general, of course, your motivation for wanting to learn a certain topic can also be a little bit more broad as to maybe it will be good for your career, or maybe you just want to learn more about this topic for personal curiosity, or maybe in the future you think you could implement it and maybe start a company around this topic, something like that. And I think it's just good to have this written down somewhere. So having your goal and your motivation as to this goal written down, we move on to the next topic, and that's step 2, and that's to find the right learning resources. And I want to preface this by saying that finding resources is actually by itself a project. It will probably take some time to set up the right learning references and the right learning resources. And the reason for this is oftentimes, if we are engaging on a self-learning journey, there isn't a clear path set out for us that is perfect. So unless you're learning about a topic that millions of people have learned before you, it is quite hard to find the exact right resources to learn about something. So for example, in my case, cognition and psychosis, although there has been a lot written about this, there's not like a clear learning path for it. So even finding the resources and curating your own learning journey will take definitely some time, and it's also an iterative process. So as you are gathering these resources, they will probably update over time. But I will give you insight as to how I do it. So the first thing I do to create my own knowledge framework or knowledge pipeline is to find a good review that has been written in the last 5 years, or 10 reviews in my case sometimes. But you will start with this review kind of as your beginning point. So for example, I would go on some of the journals that I know quite well. So this can be Nature, Nature Neuroscience, Nature Mental Health, etc. And I would look for my specific topic, in this case, cognition and psychosis, and look for a review that was written in the last, let's say 5 to 10 years. It depends a little bit how often something is being published on your topic. And then from that review, I would go to the author list, and I would go to the reference list and see which authors are mentioned quite often, and also which articles are mentioned quite often. So this then is a good starting point to start your reading. So oftentimes in reviews there are over 100 articles, and if you are truly interested in a topic, that's a good point to start reading most of those articles. And if you want to narrow it down a little bit that you don't feel overwhelmed, it is good to just pick maybe 5 authors that are mentioned multiple times and start with their work. Then the next thing I would do is I would look up the 10 most mentioned authors from this reference list and kind of see what they have published in the last 5 or so years. And also I would look at their recent work. I would see if they have any talks online. Also definitely a good hack. So quite often researchers give talks at conferences, for example, and a lot of us don't have the ability to attend all these conferences because they are maybe all over the world, and perhaps you don't have the budget to go to these conferences. But almost all these conferences nowadays are freely available on YouTube. So if you Google an author's name or a certain scientist's name, you can usually find a few of the lectures or a few of the talks that they've given for these type of conferences for free online. So that's usually one of the steps I also do. Then after this, something else that I do is to look at structured courses. So if you are really unfamiliar with a topic, I think it is also quite nice to look at MOOCs online. So these are courses you can follow on, for example, Coursera, Khan Academy, etc. And I think some of these are really good. So they usually have more general courses around programming, psychology, also neuroscience. And I've listed a few down below that if you're interested in neuroscience that you can check out. And the thing I like about this is that they're free. Something else that I do if I am going really crazy about a certain topic or want to learn about something is to also look at the university syllabi of of certain programs. So for example, when I really wanted to learn more about machine learning, which was a topic I was quite interested in, I looked at the general programming syllabi of different universities. So for example, Harvard or MIT usually have for their bachelor degrees the entire program listed online. You can just look which courses they have in a full degree, and usually those courses you can find online as MOOCs. And maybe they are not as good as attending live. It depends a little bit on your personality. But I personally found it very helpful to see what in general people offer in certain bachelor's degrees or certain master's degrees, and just follow it myself online at a 1.5x speed and then just gather that information like that. So maybe you've already noticed that this seems like a very extensive overview of all the things you can learn, but I think in general, if you consider that learning about a topic deeply will take about a year, creating this list is of course a really extensive process that takes about maybe 2 weeks of all the resources that you have. And then afterwards, we'll see how we can actually structure our learning such that we can actually engage with all these resources. So something else that I usually also do is to create a reading list. And I think a reading list can be a little bit more fun. So I usually don't really recommend anymore, at least for neuroscience, to read neuroscience books or neuroscience course manuals or these kind of things that are usually a little bit outdated. For that, I would just go straight to the papers and straight to the lectures. But something else that I do is usually when I learn about a topic is that I have a list of books that are more pop science books. And the reason for this is because I find it quite nice to see how we can engage with a topic that is not so university level or dry. I think it's also important to kind of nurture our curiosity and our engagement with the topic. And I think quite often more pop science books are written in a more fun and engaging way. So currently, I think you can also see all the markers I put, but for learning more about psychiatry in general, I've read this one, The Empire of Normality. Highly recommend that book. It's really good. Also, the book The Divide Itself is a little bit a controversial book, but I think also quite good if you work in psychiatry. I also in general read this short introduction on schizophrenia, and I feel these short introductions are really good. So I've read even the one on physics and neuroscience, which are both topics that I've studied for years. But somehow reading a short introduction gives a very good overview, such that if you ever want to talk about these topics with a more lay audience, it's just really good. I think highly recommend that. And I also have Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry. And I personally find it really interesting to sometimes read a bit more about the history of a certain topic that I'm learning about, because following the history of a certain topic can also give you insight in that topic's future, I find. I would definitely also advise you to create a reading list for a topic that you're interested in, and don't shy away from including some pop science books as well as some more theoretically grounded books. And if you've created it, I would actually also be really interested to see what you've created. So definitely also leave it in the comments down below. So afterwards, we kind of go to step 3, and that is to set up a self-learning schedule. So I think personally, I find creating these knowledge banks the most fun, but then comes the hard work of actually engaging with all the knowledge that we've curated and all the knowledge that we found over time. So something that is very important to do is to kind of set weekly or daily time blocks for learning and engaging with this content. So something that I personally do is I have a dedicated time block usually where I try to teach myself something or learn about a certain topic or write on a certain topic or engage with a certain topic. So I usually set this in the morning, but if you have a 9 to 5 job, I can also imagine that you, for example, would set it from 7 to 9 or even just for 1 hour from 9 to 10. And this definitely depends on your personal circumstances. So I have the luxury that my job allows me to learn, like my job is mostly focused around learning. But if you don't have this luxury, try to curate it around your schedule such that you can maybe set just 1 hour aside every day that you learn on the topic that you're interested in. Then I would usually find a group of like-minded individuals that can help you engage with this topic. But we will talk a little bit more about this later to see how you can actually stick to the schedule once you've made it. And afterwards, I think it's also really nice to curate your environment such that every time you enter that environment, you kind of think about the learning that you want to do. So for me, it's this setup at home and also at university, university, I have a place where I usually go, but also I usually have in my environment a library I like to attend, and also a few cafes that I know they don't mind if I work there or sit there for an hour with my laptop. Try to find something like that in your environment that you can go to and spend some time to learn about a certain topic. So on the note of collecting and curating your own knowledge bank, which we've previously talked about, something that I also find highly critical and important to have is a good reference manager. So I already mentioned it before that I collect all my papers in a reference manager called PaperPal, and that's also today's sponsor of the video, so I kind of want to introduce them to you. So personally, almost every academic I know uses a reference manager for organizing, citing, and annotating research, and in general there are a few reference managers out there, but I personally really like PaperPal because I think it is in general quite easy to learn, and it also stores all your papers on Google Drive. So if you are already integrated in the Google Knowledge framework, it is quite easy to have PaperPal as an extension to facilitate creating this type of reference manager and knowledge bank. So let me just show you really quickly how I use it in general. So you can search for books and articles in the PaperPal interface like this, and I think in general it's quite easy to navigate. So you can search within PDFs and even look for full phrases. So for example, if I want to know anything about normative modeling, I would just type in normative modeling, and then I would see a list of all the papers that I've gathered before that have these phrases. And I find this in general very handy, especially when you half remember what a specific paper is about, or you don't remember the title of a specific paper, but PaperPal kind of finds these papers for you. So in general, I personally tend to keep my papers in these general folders that are dedicated to one project. So in this case, one of the projects I'm working on then is schizophrenia or psychosis, but you can also label your papers if that is a little bit easier for you. I think it depends on how you think about knowledge and how you like to find certain topics, but this allows you to find papers by topic. So you can also add new papers through the browser PaperPal extension, such as Google Scholar or PubMed, or even what I mentioned before, Research Rabbit. So for example, if you are on Research Rabbit, like before, you can just easily press the PaperPal button and then it allows you to add it to your PaperPal. Finally, I also find it extremely easy to annotate articles by writing in Google Docs with the PaperPal plugin. So I personally, usually when I'm working, I just have this huge Google Doc file that I put any interesting articles or any interesting quotes, etc. that I find. But something that is very important is to make sure that you annotate correctly or that you cite correctly to give credit where credit is due. And one way you can do that is by using PaperPal within Google Docs, and in just one click, you can cite all your resources correctly. So in general, everything is securely located on Google Drive, so you don't have any risk of losing any of the papers that you find. So if you want to give PaperPal a try, click the link in the description below for a 20% off a 1-year personal subscription. So start your free 30-day trial today. So thank you again for PaperPal for sponsoring this video. So the next thing I want to talk about is how to stay consistent. Personally, for me, this has been maybe the biggest struggle of my PhD. I think it is very easy to make a plan, or at least for me, that's very easy, but sticking to a plan once it's made is a lot more difficult. So I personally think that this is where people need the most strategies, or that I need the most strategies. So I've definitely struggled in the past, especially with these long projects that I just get a little bit bored halfway through and I start looking for new projects to engage on or embark on. But especially in a PhD, because you have to kind of write a paper at the end of every project, or at least write something up. You cannot really start doing new projects when old ones aren't finished yet. So I want to give you some advice or some tips that have worked for me, but I've definitely noticed talking to other colleagues that everyone has different strategies of how to deal with boredom or loss of motivation, and I think this is very personal. So if some of these strategies don't work for you, I hope that you will just keep on trying and find strategies that do work for you. Or if you have other strategies that you found that work for you, please list them down below, because I'm always curious to learn how other people deal with loss of motivation. So in general, one of the first things I think is that works really well is to make learning kind of interactive. So join study groups, book clubs, create challenges. So I think in general, if you do learning with other people, it makes it a little bit easier because they kind of keep you accountable. So one thing that we are currently doing with postdocs, for example, is that we come together once a week and we set a Pomodoro session for every day to write for 50 minutes and then have a 10-minute discussion. And I was also thinking of creating something like this online, like something like a writer's hour. So there is already this writer's hour, which I will also list below, which is this community of writers where people can come together and write together. But I wanted to create something specific for researchers, where researchers can come together and write together. I think that would be really nice. So if that interests you, you can also sign up to a newsletter that I put down below. I almost never post anymore, but if you would be interested in joining something like an online community, I think that could be really interesting. That said, you don't have to join a specific community or online course or whatever. You can also just ask one friend or a colleague to join you and kind of together work on this 50 minutes writing together, 15 minutes learning together, and then 10 minutes break. Because I think learning together just makes the entire learning process a lot more fun and engaging. So the second thing that really worked well for me is to balance learning with application. So kind of what I talked in the very beginning about is to have a specific goal for your learning. So I think it is really important to don't get stuck in the learning about learning and instead apply some of the learning that you've done. So in general, I think it's really nice if throughout the process of learning you have these smaller in-between goals where you see if you can apply some of the learning that you've done. So maybe if you, for example, read 5 articles, try to write 500 words about what you've read. Or if you've seen a lot of lectures, try to recreate one of the figures that they've shown in one of the lectures. And I think for me, this really helps me engage with the content on a deeper level and also kind of keeps me motivated because I can see the progress that I'm making. And lastly, it's to work consistently no matter what happens. And this sounds quite dramatic, but I think this really helped me in the final weeks of my PhD. So the final weeks of my PhD, I had to write my introduction and discussion that kind of ties together the entire PhD. And I noticed that I found this really difficult. And the reason probably was that I had to look back on the last 4 years and everything that I had learned about and tie it together into one coherent narrative. And I don't know if I've done a good job, but I've at least finished this part. And one of the ways that I did it is to set really strict deadlines for myself. So every morning from 8 to 10, I had to sit down behind my desk and I had to write. And I usually tried to write at least 500 words. And some days I managed and some days I didn't. And some days I definitely also deleted all the work that I had made previously. But one thing that really helped me was this consistency of just showing up every morning, sitting down at the exact same desk at the exact same time and just writing. And I think definitely sometimes this type of strictness and this type of regularity is needed when you really want to learn or want to engage with a certain topic. So the final thing I want to talk about is some of the tools or resources that you can use to track your progress. And I kept it very simple during my PhD. So in general, I use Notion, of course, but I won't talk too much about Notion anymore because I've talked about it so much in the past already. But one of the things that I currently really use is to just have one Google Doc where I write down everything that I do. So where I store my research, key takeaways, and evolving ideas. So again, I use also Paperpal to cite anything that I want in the meantime. So in general, I have this really long Google document that I update daily with everything that I've learned about and uncovered. And this may seem super simple, but in general, I think for me, it works really well. I just have all the questions, key highlights, and even notes that I write to myself in this one big document. And everything is kind of mixed together. And only at the very end, I would curate this into one paper. Then the second thing I use is a bullet journal. I always have this kind of bullet journal next to me, so I cannot really show too many details, but everything is kind of listed like this. And the thing I track in this bullet journal is I write down usually questions. I write down exactly every minute almost what I'm doing, which seems really obsessive, but it's kind of nice to track afterwards to just see what I'm working on. And also at the end of each session, so each writing session that I do or each working session that I do, I kind of write down what the current bottleneck is in the bullet journal. So for example, did I not spend enough time? Did I not have the right resources? What are the main open questions? What am I struggling with? And the reason I write this down is because usually over time, I can kind of see which parts of the project are not working or which part of the learning I'm not managing well and what I need to learn more about during the next session, which helps me then again update my knowledge bank. Lastly, something that I use is voice notes, especially during the PhD. I use this a lot. I think talking to yourself, clarifying your thoughts, and having these moments to really talk through some of the problems works really well. I think talking out loud is one of the resources a lot of us don't utilize enough. So I definitely highly recommend you to experiment with this as well. And then from all this information, I usually memorize all this information, create new projects, make presentations, create the papers from this, etc. And this may seem very messy, but I think in essence, when trying to discover or learn something new outside of university, it is just a really messy process. And I hope that seeing how this process actually unfolds, at least for me, kind of gives you some insight in how this could look like for you, and also kind of maybe comfort you that learning about a new topic isn't as straightforward as people online sometimes try to make it look. I think in general, learning about anything new is messy, just like how life is a little bit messy. And I think structuring your own learning journey by itself is already a learning journey. So I hope that you've learned something from this, and otherwise I see you next time. Bye!